Hello students, this is Alan Bors and this is Anthropology 325. I'm talking to you from my office here at the Anthropology Lab at Kenai Peninsula College, and now we move into the historic era, the era from which we can glean some information from written records, and we supplement that with archaeological records. So we'll focus on the period from 1778 to 1867 in this lecture. I'll probably split it into two because it's fairly long, and I'll find a convenient spot to break this. So this is lecture 1, and lecture 2 will follow from that point as a separate download to make it easier for you. So first of all, to distinguish anthropological approaches from other approaches, and that is some of the theoretical contexts that anthropology uses to look at cultural events and some of the themes. This certainly isn't exclusive to anthropology, but anthropology is not just the historic record. It is looking at from a theoretical point of view. So some of the theories and themes that might apply to what we're talking about here: colonization, neo-colonization, and what is called decolonization, the indigenous people reasserting rights to areas. Certainly globalization and resource control is part of the story. We'll talk about the fur trade here in this set of lectures, but later we'll talk about the even more significant cannery, salmon canning industry that came in the late 1800s. World systems theory, or world systems analysis more properly, is another approach that can be applied. Emanuel Wallerstein, among others, developed the idea there is a core, semi-periphery, and a periphery. Power is exerted from the core and toward the periphery, and resources are extracted from the periphery and go to the core. Modernization theory is somewhat related. Max Weber was involved with that. More recently, W. Rostow. This is the idea there is a first world, second world, and third world. Some say even a fourth world. And through various practices, the third world eventually moves up to become second world countries, and second world countries move up to first world countries. Somewhat similar to the core, semi-periphery, and periphery idea of Wallerstein. That one is debatable. Modernization theory is debatable because normally that does not happen, although arguably you could say that China today is moving from second world to first world status. Questions of sovereignty. Huge questions in indigenous Alaska, in native Alaska. Who owns the land? Who controls? Questions of dominance. Dominance through violence and war, but also symbolic violence. Violence in the sense of capturing another culture's images to dominate them. And we talked about that in the last lecture, having to do with the use of raven on the Kenai Peninsula. Governmentality is the idea that governments use techniques to produce good citizens, and that's part of this historic record as well. And the question of missionization and religious syncretism or not, as interpreted by how we look at the story. And last, indigenization, the idea that as Western cultures exerted themselves in Alaska, people like the Dena'ina and others did not necessarily adopt particularly religious views whole scale, but indigenized them, put them in the context of traditional culture, and we'll point out some situations where that occurred. So if any of these are unfamiliar to you, do a Google search of them. still Wikipedia, good old Wikipedia, is one of the best entries and portals into some of these ideas. So, there we go. I want to show you two images. One you're very familiar with. The one in the upper right was painted by John Vanderlyn. It's called The Landing of Columbus. It hangs in the rotunda of the Capitol in Washington, D.C. It's huge. I don't know its size. I've seen it. It's, I don't know, it's 10 feet across, maybe even bigger. I don't know. It seemed huge. There's a whole series of them. And here is Columbus coming stridently into the new land, planting the flag of the King of Spain, and taking sovereign control. And where are the natives? Get my pen here. The natives are in the distance, naked and running away. It's a painting of manifest destiny. We might interpret this painting in terms of modernization theory. We might interpret it in terms of world systems theory, or perhaps others. But it portrays a point of view. It's used often. It's used in many history books, high school, college probably, history books, as the visual to show the coming to the new land. Point of fact, it probably wasn't quite this strident. But it presents a point of view. In 1991, the city of Kenai commissioned a mural to commemorate the Russian landing at Kenai in 1791 by Grigor Gonovalov and Company, sailing for the Lebedev-Lashtokin Company and becoming the first Russian presence in Kenai itself. Actually, a fort had been established a few years before at the mouth of the Kisilov, so it wasn't certainly the first time Denina had seen Russians, and as we'll point out shortly, the Cook and others had been in the area as well. So they commissioned this painting, and it seemed like they thought they were going to get the Vanderlyn style painting. Russians coming to Alaska, bringing commerce and industry. But instead, Olivia Szymanski, along with help from some members of the Kenai tribe, painted quite a different image. Here it's the Russians that are done small and distant, and the Denina that are done large. And she tried to portray, and I think did so very well in this mural, some of the reactions of the Denina. I'll show you some here in the second slide, but I just want to point out before we go there, the ship is really a dead ringer for Captain Cook's ship. Undoubtedly, the Russian ship was not quite that fancy or sophisticated, but I'll certainly cut her a little slack for that one. Some other images from that same painting, the landing. Denina, I don't know how you would say it, puzzling over it. Despair, in this case. Here she shows a shamanic reaction to it, for which she got a lot of criticism because some in the community considered that satanic and wanted it taken down. Eventually it was taken down. It was taken down and warehoused, and so it's not available for view anymore. So these two paintings are indicative of points of view. The latter, I would say, is an indigenized point of view. And looking at the context of history, from the standpoint of an indigenous perspective, whereas the former, the Vanderlyn painting, is more of a manifest destiny style. For you, it's not my place to tell you what perspective you should have, but you should be aware that history is not neutral. History is written from a perspective. History is written from a point of view, and you should be aware of the author's point of view when you read history. It's not that you shouldn't read the one that doesn't agree with your point of view, but you should be aware of the author's point of view. And you should have one yourself, and it should be continually evolving. My point of view in this story is going to be an indigenized point of view, filtered through the lens of an anthropologist. So that's where I stand, and that's what you're going to get. And you should look at this interpretation from that point of view. But just bear in mind, there is no neutral history. There are facts of dates and so on, but even what you present as the significant facts or dates, what did you leave out? You can't put everything in, and what you leave out is also a kind of interpretation. There's a book called Once Upon the Kenai, which has almost no. It's a sort of a family history, but there's almost no reference to natives in that book. It's a point of view. So let's look at the story. So we'll start from a European perspective with Peter the Great, Tsar of Russia, 1672 to 1725. This image painted by a student of Raphael, hence the light showing on his forehead. And it's a very significant painting because Peter the Great is breaking with tradition. He has no beard. Russian Orthodoxy required men to have a beard. And he was striking out, breaking on his own, trying to modernize Russia, which at the time was sort of a Byzantine, not very progressive, to use that term, nation in Europe. So he built an army. He and the Swedish king chased each other around northern Europe in the Great Northern War, each trying to claim dominance for the northern trade routes. He built St. Petersburg where there was a swamp. He brought in people with technological experience, mostly Germans, to help modernize Russian industry. All this cost money. And so he engaged in an agenda to push Russian culture to the east, whereas in the United States and Canada we have the "Go West, Young Man" slogan. It was going to the sun, go east to the sun in Russia. And he did it for a purpose. So the next slide shows the vanguard of that eastward movement, the Zemla Prohodsky. I love saying that word, Zemla Prohodsky. And they were equivalent of the the mountain men of the American West, sort of individuals, rugged individuals. This guy's a rugged guy. He's knifing a bear, and they were engaged primarily in sable trapping, and so sable was the fur of choice in Europe, particularly Germany. So Peter the Great encouraged that trapping, and so men would go out, they would trap. The furs would be gathered in zimavi, like the one in the lower left here. They were consolidated. They were brought west, and they were taxed as they passed through Moscow area, and then sold in Germany, and when the money came back in, it was taxed again. So Peter the Great figured out a lot of ways to tax people. As I'm recording this, it's tax time here, and so I'm very sensitive to taxes. Peter the Great was taxing people, and taxing people because he had to pay for his big projects, and a lot of it came on the back of this poor little animal, the sable. In truth, in advertising, I have to point out that this is actually not a sable. This is the North American equivalent, a marten. The only difference, I think, is this little white spot right here, but I know somebody listening to this would know that and would say, "Hey, that's a marten, not a sable." But for the rest of us, it's pretty close. Fur of choice, so that's the point. And that meant Russian culture was pushed further and further to the east, eventually getting closer and closer to the far east coast of Russia, although at the time they didn't know where that was. So as Russian culture moved east and towns were developed, they encountered indigenous peoples. And that's significant to our story because once it jumps over to Alaska, the Russians who were engaged in the fur trade were familiar with the indigenous peoples of the north. For example, who the group described as the Tungus, the Evans and the Evenki are more accurate names, reindeer herders of the Taiga. Was one of the cultures they encountered. Still around, still there, still dealing with issues much like indigenous peoples in Alaska. And they were familiar with shaman. Here's a in the lower left here is a Tungus shaman, and we're familiar with those activities. The Koryak, more of a maritime hunting group, and the Edelman, who they referred to as Kamchadal, of the Kamchatka Peninsula. The Edelman culture is very, very similar to Dena'ina culture. Salmon, moose, bears, caribou, or they call them reindeer. Plant foods were very similar, a very, very similar culture to that of the Dena'ina, and there's a modern Edelman woman. They are engaged, I've read, in revitalization, both language revitalization and cultural revitalization. So the point is that the Russians, as they described in Alaska, they would often describe people in Alaska, they would often hearken back to people they had known, from indigenous people they had known from Russia. So this is a 18th century woodcut, I believe it's a woodcut, of Ohutsk, which is on the coast. Ohutsk today is about 600-700 people, but it was a major trading center in the 18th century. It was the place that most of the voyages to Alaska emanated from. And so from this place, voyages came toward Alaska. So let's talk about Bering and Alexei Chirikov, Vitus Bering and Alexei Chirikov's voyage, which would be the first one. There were two voyages. The first was commissioned by Peter the Great, 1725, 1730. In it, Bering, who was a Dane, actually, and this is the classic picture of Bering, but it turns out it's his brother or uncle, and not actually Vitus himself. So until they come up with a better, real image of Vitus, we'll use his brother and uncle to say he sort of looked like that. He was a Dane, a ship captain in the Russian Navy that Peter the Great had created, and Alexei Chirikov was the second. So we can kind of pick it up here. This is Russia, Moscow, somewhere over in here. And they went all the way across Siberia, across the Urals, across Siberia, to Ohutsk, to here, on foot, with horses. And there they built boats, and they sailed across to the Kamchatka Peninsula. So here's Ohutsk here, and they sailed across, and they went across, and from there they built ships again, and were charged with finding where the Asian continent ended, and was it connected to what we know today as Alaska. Didn't know that then. So off he went, and Bering sails up this way, and they get about in this area, and he sees something through the fog, and what he's seeing is Alaska, and good enough for him, and he turns around and goes back. Chirikov was quite livid. He said, we've come this far, let's at least go around the corner, let's go further, let's explore a little more. But Bering was the cautious one, and turned around, goes back, and reports to Peter the Great that there is a land over there that came to be called Bolshaya Zemlya. Bolshaya Zemlya, the Great Land. Unbeknownst to anyone, a seaman Dezhnev had made that same voyage, I forget, about 10, 15 years earlier, and his report had become buried in a bureaucrat's file in either Ohutsk or Irkutsk. I think it's Irkutsk, and so no one knew about it. That's what happens when bureaucrats bury files. So they go back and report it. Before a second voyage can be initiated, the Crimean War occurs, and other activities that Peter the Great is engaged in. So it's not until 1733 that the next expedition occurs, and by this time I think Peter the Great is no longer Tsar. But they do the same thing. They go overland. They go across to the Kamchatka Peninsula. I'm still not sure why they didn't just sail around, but they didn't. And from here now they go on a more southerly course. So let's see. The dashed line is Chirikov's voyage. So about here they become separated. And the solid line is Bering's voyage. So here's Chirikov, and he lands somewhere near Sitka. And he sends some men on shore to get water. They don't come back. He sends some more men on shore to try to find the first group. They don't come back. He decides this is not a great place, so he gets out of there, and he sails up the channel. I assume they finally got water, but here he's cutting across about to here, and about here he in his journals he notes a volcano, which is about where Iliamna is. So apparently he was able to see Iliamna from that point, and eventually he makes it back to, it was Petropavlovsk where they started. They had gotten separated, so Bering ends up on this tack here, and he ends up on the far side of Prince William Sound. And he sends some men ashore. Included in that is George Steller, who was the naturalist on board. Steller was German, and makes the first encounter with Alaskan natives. And they had just left their camp. They hear them talking in the woods. The campfire was still going. They were cooking something. And Mueller took some of their implements, and he left an iron pot and some tobacco. And he was only given a short time to be on shore, and eventually, he had to get out of there. So that was the first encounter, or shall we say non-encounter. Interestingly, a number of years later, when let's see, about 1786, I think it was, someone who had been a boy in that camp met Ismailov, who was planting plaques to claim the land for Russia. And the man now, who had been a boy, told Ismailov, "Thanks for the iron pot and thanks for the tobacco." Bering has proved there's land, and that was what he was set out to do. And he's essentially proved in a roundabout way that it's a continent and it's land. And so he heads back, and they crash land. This is bad weather. It was horrible weather, foggy, difficult, and they crash on Bering Island. Bering dies. Steller marshals the troops the next spring, and they eventually make it back to Petropavlovsk and Russia. So, there's a picture of the boats, the St. Peter, and the companion boat was the St. Paul. So that's the first contact in Alaska. What came of that was the seagoing fur trade. So the land fur trade had been promoted, and now the seagoing fur trade was promoted by reports of the sea otter. So as you know, seals insulate themselves with fat. Other sea mammals do as well, but sea otter insulate themselves with fur. Very luxuriant fur, said to be some of the thickest, most dense fur in the world. And it was the fur of choice in China. Here's a Chinese hat trimmed with fur otter that would be from that time period. China was officially closed to Westerners at that time, but with the eastward expansion, Russia was able to initiate a fur trade by the seagoing fur trade, then coming back to Russia and bringing then the furs into China overland, and sort of through the back way, so to speak. So other countries weren't possible. It wasn't possible to do that. So they sailed in small boats, Russians. They formed a company, a temporary company. Usually these companies lasted 1 year, maybe 2. And off they went and got into a Aleut community in the Aleutian Islands. They take the women and children hostage, forcing the men to hunt sea otter for them for the summer. So then exchange the women and children for the sea otter pelts in the fall. And in so doing, they were decimating the sea otter populations. And not to mention the Aleut culture. This was extremely lucrative. I worked it out in $1990 once, where one ship would make as much as $6 million on about a $50,000 investment. So they had to build a ship, hire a crew, and then that would make as much as $6 million. That's huge. It was about $80 a pelt in $800 a pelt in $1990. So it was lucrative, and as a result, a lot of people got into it. So here's a map of that time period, 1779 Kebelev map, and they'd go out and come back, out and come back, out and come back, and going further each time because they were not practicing sustained yield of sea otter. They were wiping them out and had to go further and further and further. Note that this map it's a Russian map, but it's in German. Many of the reports were in German because German was the lingua franca of the time, the official sort of language of science and discovery. And but this is a Russian map, and they're getting closer and closer to where we're interested in. But it's taking longer and longer for each voyage, and more dangerous for each voyage. So here we sit. Here we are, with a number of countries being interested in what you could say is one of the last places to be mapped and developed and colonized in the Northern Hemisphere. So at this time, in the late 1700s, there were 3 countries that were interested in this area for colonization purposes. One was England, and they sent James Cook and James Clark to 60 degrees north latitude. Many of the documents say go to 60 degrees north latitude and claim this for our country. 60 degrees north latitude is about where Ninilchik is today. So this, in other words, come to Cook Inlet, and they claimed it in various ways. The British claimed it by planting a bottle with some British coins in it in the ground, and I'll tell you the story of point possession in a moment. In 1779, the next year, Ignacio Ortego and Bodega y Quadra came, sailing for Spain. They held a mass. The British tended to have a naturalist on board, although Cook was his own naturalist. The Spanish had a priest, and they would go on shore and they would hold a mass to claim land. In 1786 and 87, Nathaniel Portlock and George Dixon came for England. It had already been claimed, but they were trying to establish a trade. In 1788, Esteban Martinez and Lopez de Haro sailed past the outer peninsula, not into the Cook Inlet itself, for Spain. Russia got back in the act in 1788 and 89. Gerasim Izmailov, he's the guy with the pot and the tobacco, thanks, and Dmitry Bochurov of Russia, and they planted the eagle crests of the Romanov Tsars. We'll talk about that in a bit. Also for Russia, Joseph Billings, he was British, but he was hired by the Russians to sail. He also did not go into Cook Inlet, but just past the outer part. In 1790, Salvador Fidalgo for Spain came. He also held a mass. It had already been claimed once, but why not claim it again? And he held a mass claiming it. And in 1794, George Vancouver and Peter Puget, sailing for England, came back. All were vying for control, and of course eventually that control would fall to Russia, at least for a short time period. So let's talk about Captain Cook. Captain Cook was arguably one of the world's greatest mariners, and in the late 1700s he was England's top gun, if you want, in terms of navigators. He was innovative, he was good, he was experienced, made good decisions. One, for example, is his boat was a coal hauling boat. The Endeavour, the Resolution, and the Resolution and his 3 voyages around the world were not fancy, fast, clipper-type ships. They were coal-hauling boats because he knew he would be in trouble in bays, inlets, and so on, and therefore wanted something that wanted a pickup truck of a boat, if you will. So these are his 3 voyages. It's the blue one that we're interested in. He sailed in 1776. Just a week before or a week after, I can't remember, the July 4th, 1776 proclamation, Declaration of Independence. So had that happened, say, a month earlier, he might never have been out on this, but he was unaware of that for, I think, well, he never became aware of it. He was killed. So off he goes from England and to places he's been before, New Zealand, and he sails around and up, finds Hawaii, names it Sandwich Sound after his benefactor, Lord Sandwich, and is told to go to the coast of North America and to sail to 60 degrees north latitude and further if you can, to try to find a northwest passage that will lead, whoop, I'm doing that a little wrong here, sorry, I gotta get an eraser. Eraser. Huh, how about that? Pen. Go this way. That would lead across to England, which is right over here. Could be coming in this way. There were reports of riches, of wealth. One of them was the sea otter reports from Vitus Bering, and the British were intensely interested in a northwest passage. So he was told specifically, do not waste time exploring bays and inlets. This was not a journey of just discovery, find out what's there. This was a journey to find the Northwest Passage. So here's Captain Cook. He left in 1778. This is his boat, the HMS Resolution. You can see this flat coal hauling boat. The companion ship was the same type, and this would have been the first boat that Denina would have seen in Cook Inlet. Elegant watercolor, beautiful boat, beautiful ship, and directed by one of the greats. On the crew were were sort of a who's who of British exploration. The second in command was Charles Clark. Charles or James? I think it's James Clark. I might have that wrong. John Gore was third in command. Gore was actually an American. Had they known, he wouldn't have been on that voyage, but Gore was on Cook's boat as third in command overall. There were two master's mates. They were sort of like graduate students. They were in their 20s, and they would be learning to be sailors. William Bligh, the famous Bligh of Captain Bligh notoriety, was a master's mate, as was George Vancouver. George Vancouver would return to Cook Inlet later as a captain himself. John Webber was the artist. Many of the beautiful drawings and later turned into woodcuts were done by John Webber. James King was a lieutenant. He was the person that actually went on shore in Cook Inlet. Nathaniel Portlock was, I forget what his role was. He was on that voyage as well. He would have been a younger man. And here's Lord Sandwich, and the Parliament. He was Cook's benefactor. In other words, he was his supporter. He would push for Cook to get the good jobs. And in return, Cook would tend to name things after him, among others. He would name the Sandwich Islands, Hawaii we call it today. He called Prince William Sound Sandwich Sound. Montague Island was Sandwich's given name, and so on. And Sandwich is said to have invented the sandwich so he could eat and play poker at the same time. I don't know if that's true, but I'll repeat that lore just because it's a good story, but I'm not sure that's true. Cook had two maps with him. He had a map done by Stalin and a map done by Mueller, both Germans, but both based on Russian information. This lower map, the Mueller map, is closer to what we know today. So remember, he's coming up the coastline, and he doesn't want it to be this. He doesn't want it to be blocked. He wants a northwest passage. So the Stalin map was the map he really wanted to have. This is kind of cut off here. I'm sorry about that, but he wants this opening here. So he's hoping for an opening. So up they come the coast. This is Cook's own map, really remarkable for the day. And up they come, and no break in the coast, no break in the coast, all the way up until you get to Prince William Sound, right about here. And at that point, Gore, who is on Cook's ship, is excited. Here's the break. This is confirmed by the Mueller map. We're going to find it. Remember, Cook has in the back of his head, do not waste time exploring bays and inlets. So he's reticent. So all of the master's mates on up of the officers had to keep a journal. So I've got them all. I've read them all. They're all a little different. And from those, the composite journal was made. But Gore's the one who really thought you could go in. Cook writes himself, he said, I don't know. You can kind of read between the lines. You can see in the back of his head what's kicking around is don't waste time exploring bays and inlets. But he does decide to go in. He uses a ruse. He said, well, we've got a leak in the ship, so we should go in and fix it. So in he goes. And they go into Prince William Sound as far as Snug Corner Cove. And there you see the two British ships off there in the distance. And these are probably Alutiiq speaker, Sukpiaq speakers, Alutiiq, and their large boats and their kayaks. And they anchor there for several days. He sends Bligh and Vancouver out in longboats. They don't see anything that looks like a Northwest Passage. So that's right there where he was. So he comes out. He names Montague Island. He names Hinchinbrook Island. Montague was Sandwich's last name. Hinchinbrook was his estate in Kent. And he sails, continuing to look for a Northwest Passage. And about here in the journals, they see this opening here. And of course, they all comment on it, particularly Gore. And, this is it, Captain. This is it. We've found the Northwest Passage. It's confirmed by the Mueller map. And I call this the long tack of indecision. So Cook tacks, and he's puzzling whether to go in. You can see it in his journal, and he comes back again. And about here, he says, okay, we're going in. And, whoops, I didn't draw that so well. He goes in. Okay. He goes in, and he hits the Barren Islands. And about here, he gets caught in the Cook Inlet tides. And he is impressed. Very impressed. Now, remember, they're in wooden ships. They have no power other than the wind. So they are at the tide's mercy as they ride in. And that's a real no-no as far as wooden sailing ships go. You need to be in control. But he had no choice. And so they ride it in about to here, and here they anchor up. And as the tide turns, the ships swing round, and the big hawser, the big rope that holds the anchor to the ship, breaks. And Cook is livid. He's livid not because the rope broke, but because the man on watch was supposed to immediately throw a buoy out to drag for the anchor, so they could later drag for the anchor and recover it, because you just couldn't go to the hardware store and buy another anchor. They did have another anchor. So he rides in, riding and anchoring. About here, it doesn't really show correctly on this, but he sees the fires of the Salamadoff Beach area right here, Denina, assuredly. And in his journal, he describes going across toward those fires. But no contact yet. Up they go. They're looking for the Northwest Passage. It's becoming grimmer and grimmer. And he anchors here off of Point Possession right here. And he sends Bligh up, so he's anchored right here. He sends Bligh in a longboat, with men rowing, of course, up Kinnick Arm, and he sends, I believe it was King, up Turnagain Arm. So here's Kinnick Arm, here's Turnagain Arm. And in both cases, they go about halfway up to where it becomes apparent that this is not the break, this is not the Northwest Passage, and they turn around. And they report back to Cook, no, it's not the Northwest Passage. Almost 15 years later, the Admiralty sends Vancouver back. So desperately did they want a Northwest Passage that they sent Vancouver back to really to go all the way up. Because maybe it's just next down and it's going to open up. Of course it didn't. So Cook is anchored here, and he sends some men on shore. King was in charge, Lieutenant King, and the surgeon Law was part of it. I don't know how many. It sounded like about 10 or 12. They go on shore, and they are instructed to take possession. And at that point, Denina, probably from the village of Point Possession, come to meet them. The surgeon, it's cordial, but the surgeon buys one of the Denina dogs. Does pay for it. Not sure what good the money would do those folks then, but he bought a dog and he shot and killed it. And that was to demonstrate the power of a musket. Denina had not seen a musket, at least as the British describe it, and this was common practice by the British to demonstrate the power of a musket to indigenous peoples, so that it would minimize their troubles. The possession ceremony consisted of a bottle and some coins of the year. See, this is 1778. I think the coins are from 1774. I can't, somewhere in there. Obviously before they left in 1776. The bottle, not in the official journal, but in one of the journals, was full of beer. So they took the bottle of beer on shore, they drank the beer, and they put the coins in the bottle and they buried it. And in this way they took possession of the land for England. In those days you took possession by a ceremony, and that was to assist with later claims to sovereign ownership. It didn't work because the Russians superseded that by occupying, at least in part, the Cook Inlet area. So it was an attempt to create sovereign ownership. While here, Cook writes in his journal, perhaps someone will find some use, perhaps someday someone will find some use for this land, but alas for me, it was a waste of time, and hence we have to turn again. So he names this Turnagain Arm. Later we've called the pass Turnagain Pass, and off he goes back out Cook Inlet. For him, it was a waste of time. He spent 10 days here. He never got off the boat. Most of you have spent more time in Cook Inlet than he did. Nevertheless, he's given great recognition. So he comes out this way, and about here, as the tide is dropping, he gets stuck on Middle Ground Shoal. So at high water, it's of course water, but as it drops, it sticks up, and both his boats get stuck. If they had not been those flat-bottomed coal-hauling boats, things might have turned out quite differently, but because they were the next high tide, the boats floated, and off he went. So Captain Cook is recognized. He did not name Cook Inlet. He left that blank. He named everything else. And it was the Admiralty that pushed to call it initially Cook's River and later Cook Inlet. And so that's the name we've got. The Dena'ina name was Tikatnu. Tikatnu. Big water. Big water river. Tikat. Big water or ocean. New river. Tikatnu. Cook Inlet. The next year, rather incredibly, the Spanish came to Cook Inlet, and the King of Spain, the young King of Spain then, Juan Carlos, had instructed Mexico, Spain, to expand to the west coast. Spain had occupied Mexico for almost 200 years, but they had never moved over and occupied the west coast of Spain. And Juan Carlos dictated that, and that they move up the coast, and eventually the San Diego, San Francisco, all those places were established. But initially, two men, Ignacio Ortego and Bodega y Cuadra, were sent to sail up the coast, and this was more of a mission of reconnaissance, or really of a spy mission. They were sent to see what the Russians were doing. So here's their names. So some of the names are still here. Valdez or Valdez was on. I guess I don't see it on here. Here's Cabo Frio, Cold Cape, and this is Cook Inlet, initially called Revillagigedo de la Nuestra Our Lady of the Rule, or Our Lady of the Virgin. So this is Bodega y Cuadra. I couldn't find a picture of Ignacio Ortego. Perhaps he sort of dropped out of sight. I don't know. But Bodega y Cuadra became very famous, and he operated in the Vancouver Island area, California. Bodega Bay in California is named for him. Here are a couple of Spanish maps. This one is from... first one is, I can't read it. I can't remember either. I think that's the Bodega map right there. I'm coming up, and this is the map of Salvador Fidalgo. So he did come into Cook Inlet as far as Kenai. He himself didn't get beyond here, but he sent a boat up to actually Kisilov, where there was a Russian post. So that's Salvador Fidalgo. The Spanish were not particularly interested in economic development in the north. They were more interested in boundaries to Russian expansion into California. So they sort of drop out of sight. Yeah, there we go, Fidalgo's map. So it came to Gregor Shelikov to develop this vision, and Shelikov was one of those traders that had been building boats yearly, forming a company, going out, getting sea otter, coming back, sometimes making a lot of money, sometimes not. And he got this vision, this idea, that he would create a colony in this new land. His idea was based on the model of the British East India Company. The British East India Company had a monopoly granted by England. And his thought was that he would establish a colony in initially Kodiak, and he did at Three Saints Bay down here. And to do that, he wanted a monopoly. So he appealed to Catherine the Great, Catherine the First, who was Tsar at the time, Tsarina at the time, to have this bold scheme, this monopoly, and so all of his writings about anything he did in Alaska are self-glorifying, self-gratifying. One of his earlier trips, he ended up on Kodiak. He himself came. I don't forget how many Russians came, but they tragically, essentially conquered the Kodiak Island. They had cannons. They forced Kodiak onto offshore islands at low tide. High tide came up, and they bombarded them. And the Alutiiq Museum in Kodiak has done excavations at that island to demonstrate that. He was a cruel man. He was a horrific person. And why we named Shelikof straight after him is beyond me. Catherine the Great heard his plea for a monopoly, but she had been reading Adam Smith. Adam Smith, called the father of capitalism, and Smith the Britisher, Enlightenment philosopher, and Catherine denied his request for a monopoly because it was anti-capitalistic. Nevertheless, he pushed forward with his plans, and he developed a post initially at Three Saints Bay, shown in the woodcut here in the bottom. And that's a picture of Three Saints Bay right there. And proceeded to develop a number of other posts. And these are the posts. In 1784, Three Saints Bay, it was a Shelikof Company post, as Vesti Delaroff being the manager. He later, the next year, moved on to the peninsula and established Alexandrov Redoubt at Nanwalek. Redoubt is a fort. It's a Shelikof Company. Vasily Malikov was the first in charge. 2 years later, a rival company, it's described as a rival company, Lebedev-Lashtokin Company, established a post at St. George, Georgievsk Redoubt at the mouth of the Kosilov River, where Peter Goleman was in charge. When I say rival company, we're going to talk about those rivalries, but Shelikof had a significant financial interest in Lebedev's company. They weren't really rivals in the sense of the word, and I'll try to describe that later. In 1791, Nikolaevsk Redoubt was established at Kenai. Gregor Gonovalov, the notorious Gregor Gonovalov, was in charge. The Kodiak post was moved from Three Saints Bay to St. Paul, Pavlovsk Redoubt, or Kodiak, modern Kodiak, in 1792, where Alexander Baranov was in charge. And Voskresenskaven, or Sunday Harbor, was established that same year at Seward as a shipbuilding post. That's all they did there. I'll show you pictures of most of these. And St. Constantine was the Lebedev post in Prince William Sound, where initially Hms Resolution was in charge. That was a spin-off of the Nikolaevsk post. And in 1801, the Russian America Company was founded, where Baranov was put in charge. So this is a break of where the Lebedev Company had pulled out, and the Shelikof Company was reorganized after Shelikov's death. So here's a map of those posts. Here's Alexandrovsk, here's St. George, St. Nicholas, Sunday Harbor. Kodiak, of course, is down this way. And each had various ungarrisoned, unwalled posts. A redoubt has a wall around it. And these are called artels. One was at Iliamna, one was at Tyonik. There's also one up here in the Knik area. At least Vancouver describes it, but I have never been able to figure out exactly where that is. So some pictures of them. I should say that Peter Puget and George Vancouver come in in 1794. And there's their map. You can see they spend a lot of time up in this area. They're really trying to prove that this is the no Northwest Passage, which the Dena'ina knew, the Russians knew, but the Admiralty wanted to know. If you only can find one explorer document to read, Vancouver's is the best. Very sensitive description of the indigenous peoples. Very accurate description. The only description of the fort at Kenai. Very interesting document. There's just two ships. Puget on one of them, Vancouver on the other. So let's look at some of the places. Here's Nanwalek. This is the airstrip at Nanwalek, and the post is about here. So here's the post here, and this picture is taken from up this way, looking that away right there. So this spit of land in the middle of it was where the post was. This is from the 1789 map of Gerasim Izmailov, who was sent around to plant these double-headed eagle symbols of the Romanov Tsars in various places as a way to claim the land for Russia. I have a story about that. In the early 90s, in 1993, a man named Leonid Lysenko, who was a historian from Russia, sailed into the Homer Harbor with two other men on about a 40-foot sailboat. And they had sailed all the way across Russia, across the Pacific, to find this spot right here. And they had no knowledge of it, but they wanted to find this double-headed eagle. As he later explained to me, because Russia was undergoing hard times, he wanted something to instill pride in the people. So he went to the Pratt Museum, and the Pratt Museum sort of said, "You're kidding, you sailed all the way across the North Pacific with almost no gas." He wanted to trade gas for someone to go with him to help out. So they called me. Martha Madsen, who was then at the Pratt Museum, called me, and I said, "You're kidding, they sailed all across the North Pacific." So I went down to see them, and sure enough, that's what they wanted to do. So I said, well, this is America. We got to have a permit. So I got a quick permit, and we sailed over to Port Graham. You can't sail into Nanwalek itself because of the low water for a sailboat. So we went around the next day, and I told them then, I said, it's underneath an airstrip. It's, we aren't going to be able to find it. No, we'll look anyway. So here we are digging test pits in the gravel of the airstrip. They had come that far, I couldn't say, no. So we'd dig a pit, and then a plane would come, and we'd fill it in real fast, and then we'd dig another one. We found pieces of greater blade. I think we found a belt buckle. We did not find the double-headed eagle Romanov Tsar image, and it still could be down there. I don't know. And off they went. This is Kisilov. This is where the Georgievsk post was, somewhere in this picture. A couple of years ago, I borrowed a metal detector from Dave McMahon of the State Archaeologist, and within about 15 minutes I found this padlock, and this is a padlock from a late 1700s Russian site in Russia. I don't know if it's the same, but it's certainly of that era. So I think I know where that fort is, and hopefully someday I'll get to do some excavation on it. I won't tell you, I'm sorry. I'll just say it's in this photo, but we don't want looters going in before we can properly excavate it. Not that you'd loot, but you might tell somebody who would. So we'll try to protect it until we can, or someone can. This is the post at Sunday Harbor, only used for building the ship the Phoenix, which went, I don't know, 4 or 5 trips back and forth to Russia before it broke up. And St. Nicholas. So this is an interesting story. We never really knew where it was. So I was in Washington, D.C., and I was on another mission, and I had looked in a previous time, I had looked in the library of, or pardon me, in the National Archives for this map that should have been there. This is the map, the 1869 Army map of the Fort Kenai that was established in 1869. And wasn't there. They had a record of it, but they didn't know where it was. So I was there, had some time, and I was walking near the Library of Congress, which is back behind the Department of Justice and the Supreme Court building. And I'll go in. Peter's book had just been printed, and I want to see this on the shelf. I didn't know if you could see it or not, but I walk in, and the first thing I see is maps and charts, and it's downstairs. So down I go, and I asked the woman behind the counter, who fortunately had only been working for a couple of days, and she was rather excited to have somebody from Alaska come. Do you know anything about an 1869 Army map of Kenai? And she says, well, I don't know. And I'll look. And so she goes back in the back part, and she brings out, honestly, a recipe box, a wooden recipe box with 3x5 note cards in it. You might look in here. This is what we have in the very back room. Page through it, and about the third card said 1869 Army map, Kenai, Fort Kenai, Alaska. I'd like to see this one, please. So this is a close-up of it. So we'll talk later about the Army's presence here. But right here, it says this is the Russian fort. So we took that and placed it on this map, and placed that on a map of Kenai. So those of you that know Kenai, this is the Orthodox Church right here. Yeah. And so as best I could, I placed it there. So it's in, gotta get right here, it's in this area right here. So that's where the Russian post was. 1791. This is my earliest drawing of it. I didn't realize it was octagonal, so it's being redrawn now, so it actually looks something like this. Oop, that's supposed to connect. And it would, because these bastions on the corners, you gotta be, oops, I'm gonna put them here. You gotta be able to shoot down the walls, so it's not exactly square. And this is my drawing of what the inside looked like of the barracks. That would have been this building right here. Well, that's Russia coming to the inlet. So I'm going to pause this. I'm going to stop this, and we're going to pick this story up, and we are going to develop the story of the Battle of Kenai, 1797. A battle between the Dena'ina and the Russians, centering on that very post. I'll back up, this post right here, and sovereign control, battle for sovereign control of this area. So thank you. I'll pause this one and get this posted, and then I'll record the second half of the lecture, the rest of the story.